This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. It happens when a system designed to move slowly is forced to move fast. When rules still exist, but obedience becomes optional. When power is no longer enforced by law, but by expectation. Most days, you never see this happen. Because when it works, it looks boring. Procedure, silence, chairs filled, people staying put. But every system has a moment when compliance costs more than resistance. And in that moment, the system does not collapse loudly. It thins. It empties. It hesitates. That hesitation is the story. If you're watching closely, you can feel it before you can name it. And if you miss how it starts, you won't recognize it when it accelerates. Stay with me. Because what looks like absence is actually a signal. And once that signal is sent, it cannot be unsent. What actually controls this system is not ideology, not elections, not even laws. It's predictability. Institutions survive because the people inside them know what will happen if they comply and what will happen if they don't. Most of the time, power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to threaten. It simply assumes obedience will arrive on time, take its seat, and follow procedure. That assumption is the real currency, because once everyone believes everyone else will stay seated, no one has to force them to. That's how order scales. But here's the destabilizing truth. This system doesn't break when someone loses a vote. It breaks when someone stops playing the role entirely, not arguing, not filibustering, not negotiating, refusing to participate. When that happens, power has nothing to push against. No speech to rebut, no rule to enforce, just empty space. And empty space inside a system built on presence is not neutral, it's corrosive. Because once people realize staying is optional, everything that depends on staying starts to wobble. And that's where this begins to get dangerous. This didn't happen all at once. That's the part most people miss. Before participation was assumed, debate happened, process mattered. Even when outcomes were ugly, the ritual held. Now, speed replaced deliberation. Urgency replaced review. Compliance replaced consent. What changed wasn't a rule on paper. It was the tempo. Decisions began arriving prepackaged. Timelines shortened. Questions were treated as delays. Delay was treated as disloyalty. Slowly, quietly, the cost of staying inside the process went up. Not politically. Psychologically, you're told it's temporary, just this once. Just because it's urgent, just because there's no time, that's how normalization works. Not by force, by repetition. And the most dangerous changes don't feel dangerous when they arrive. They feel efficient. They feel necessary. They feel inevitable. Until one day, the system asks for something it can't justify fast enough, and suddenly staying seated isn't the default anymore. That's when you see the shift. Not in votes, in movement. And what happens next is not theoretical. The shock didn't come with shouting. There was no countdown, no warning. On the schedule, everything looked ordinary. A routine session, a vote framed as urgent, unavoidable, already decided. That framing mattered because behind it was a demand. Participate now, ask questions later. No extended debate, no meaningful changes. No transparency beyond what was strictly required. That's when the room changed. Not loudly. Visibly, looks were exchanged, phones buzzed, notes moved hand to hand. Staying meant endorsing something they hadn't fully seen. Leaving meant breaking a rule that almost never breaks. So they stood not all at once, just enough to matter. Chairs scraped. Papers were gathered. Rows began to thin. And that's the moment the system failed its first stress test. Because the process could not continue without pretending nothing had happened. And pretending suddenly required effort. This wasn't the story yet. This was the symptom. And once a symptom becomes visible, The underlying condition is already advanced. Here's the mechanism that makes this dangerous. Systems like this don't run on persuasion. They run on absorption. Pressure moves downward. Risk moves outward. Accountability evaporates upward. Those at the top push speed. Those in the middle translate urgency into compliance. Those at the bottom absorb the consequences when it breaks. When everything works, no one notices. Because damage is diffuse, delayed, deniable. But when participation becomes compulsory instead of consensual, the math changes. If you stay, you own the outcome. If you object, you're isolated. If you leave, you interrupt the flow. That's why withdrawal is so destabilizing. It exposes who benefits from speed and who pays for mistakes. The system depends on people agreeing to absorb blame quietly. Once that agreement frays, enforcement has to replace trust. And enforcement is louder, messier, risquer. That's the pivot point. Because from here on out, power has to work harder to get the same result. And when power has to strain, it starts to crack. That strain is already visible, and it doesn't stay contained. After that, everything sped up. Calls, texts, rushed conversations in hallways, questions with no answers. Who left? How many? Why? Proceedings stalled. Time stretched. Cameras lingered on what wasn't there. Empty seats. Leadership tried to regain rhythm. It didn't work because the absence stayed visible. Every second made it heavier. No speeches filled the gap. No rule solved it. No warning could undo it. Pressure escalated quietly, desperately. Messages were sent. Return now. Let's reset. We can explain this later. But explanations only matter before the moment passes. Once refusal is seen, it becomes available. And that's the acceleration. What was unthinkable an hour earlier now had precedent, not permission, precedent. And systems built on routine fear precedent because fear works best when no one knows where the line is. Now the line was visible, and crossing it suddenly felt possible. Here's where this stops being abstract. Because this system doesn't just govern chambers and calendars, it governs you. When process breaks, consequences don't stay upstairs. They move outward, into timelines, into paychecks, into decisions made faster than they should be. You feel it as compression, deadlines that don't make sense, choices presented as unavoidable, outcomes you're told to accept because there's no time. That pressure isn't accidental. It's how the system exports risk. And when people inside finally refuse to absorb it, the system looks for somewhere else to send it. That somewhere else is usually you. This is why moments like this matter. Not because of who stood or left, but because they reveal how fragile compliance really is. If you've ever stayed silent to keep things moving, you already understand the trade. If this feels familiar, stay with me. Because once this dynamic becomes visible, it doesn't disappear. It relocates. This doesn't stay contained. Because systems like this don't exist in isolation. They mirror each other. They learn. When one institution discovers that speed can replace consent, others notice. Procedural shortcuts migrate. Urgency rhetoric spreads. Norms thin across borders, sectors, and structures. What looks like a local breakdown becomes a template. Internationally, predictability matters even more. Markets, alliance, treaties, they depend on the belief that decisions emerge from process, not impulse. When that belief weakens, risk premiums rise, hedging increases, trust erodes quietly. No announcement is made, no alarm sounds, just recalculation. And recalculation is a form of withdrawal. Partners hesitate, institutions slow, coordination frays. The system doesn't fail dramatically. It drifts. And drift is hard to reverse once it's accepted as normal. From here, The question isn't whether this matters globally, it's how fast the ripple travels before anyone admits it exists. From here, the future splits, not into outcomes, into paths. The first is adjustment. The system absorbs the shock. Procedure's slow. Debate is restored just enough to re-legitimize participation. Compliance returns not because fear increases, but because consent is rebuilt. This path is quiet, technocratic, fragile. The second is erosion. Nothing officially changes. Shortcuts remain. Walkouts stay rare, but no longer unthinkable. Authority still functions, but only with constant pressure. Trust drains slowly. Each decision costs more political energy than the last. Governance continues, but thinner each time. The third is rupture. Precedent compounds, refusal spreads. Participation becomes conditional, strategic, transactional. Institutions stop assuming presence. They start enforcing it. And enforcement invites resistance. None of these paths announce themselves. They overlap. They blur. And the danger isn't choosing the wrong one. It's pretending the choice isn't already being made. Because once acceleration begins, systems don't pause to ask permission. They carry forward whatever logic is left intact. There is a temptation at moments like this to look for reassurance, for a signal that the system will correct itself, that norms will snap back. That authority, once questioned, can simply be restated. That temptation is understandable and dangerous because systems don't recover by insisting they are still intact. They recover by confronting what made obedience optional in the first place. What you saw was not chaos. It was not rebellion. It was not noise. It was a signal sent without words. And signals like that don't fade on their own. They wait, they accumulate, they change how people calculate risk the next time they're asked to comply. If you want to understand where this goes, don't watch the speeches. Watch the pauses. Watch who hesitates. Watch who stays silent when staying silent used to be unthinkable. That's where the future forms. If you want to follow this thread further, how power adapts when fear stops working, and what institutions become when presence can no longer be assumed, you'll want to stay with this story. Because the next rupture won't look like the last one. And by the time it's obvious, it won't be optional anymore.